With Florida's presidential primary just days away, voters in the state are trying to get a last-minute feel for what they believe are key subjects during the upcoming election. With many interesting issues to debate about, there is no question that the upcoming elections will be all about who is making the best argument. Due to the large portion of Cuban immigrants residing in Florida, one key issue for voters in Florida is the candidate's current position on the imposed Cuban-U.S. embargo. The 48-year U.S. embargo on Cuba, enacted in 1962, aims to deny resources to the Castro regime by prohibiting most trade, travel, and financial transactions with Cuba. The embargo was enacted after Cuba expropriated the properties of U.S. citizens and corporations. The embargo was codified into law in 1992, with the stated purpose of bringing democracy to the Cuban people, and in fact is titled the Cuban Democracy Act. In 1996, Congress passed the Helms-Burton Act, which further restricted U.S. citizens from doing business in or with Cuba, and mandated restrictions on giving public or private assistance to any successor regime in Havana, unless and until certain claims against the Cuban government are met. In 1999, President Bill Clinton expanded the trade embargo even further by ending the practice of foreign subsidiaries of the U.S. companies trading with Cuba in dollar amounts totaling more than $700 million a year. At the present time, the embargo that limits American businesses from trading or conducting business with Cuban interests is still in effect, making it one of the few times in history that U.S. citizens have been restricted from doing business abroad, and is the most enduring trade embargo in modern history. Despite the existence of the embargo, it is worth noting that not all commerce from the United States to Cuba is restricted, as the United States is the 7th largest exporter of food to Cuba, mainly in the form of aid.
Cuba's regime uses the U.S. embargo as a scapegoat for Cuba's miseries. Yet presidents of both our political parties have long understood that the source of Cuba's suffering is not the embargo, but the communist system. They know that trade with the Cuban government would not help the Cuban people until there are major changes to Cuba's political and economic system. Instead, trade with Cuba would merely enrich the elites in power and strengthen their grip. As long as the regime maintains its monopoly over the political and economic life of the Cuban people, the United States will keep the embargo in place.
As stated by the current president, who believes the embargo is being used by Castro and his followers as an excuse for Cuba's current economic situation, both political parties have, in the past, understood the need to continue with the current embargo policy. Some current presidential candidates, however, believe that the embargo is having the most negative impact on the innocent Cuban citizen living on the island. Kristen believes that the embargo deprives Cubans of the bare necessities rather than debilitating the communist regime, which has proven immune to the current embargo policy over nearly the last 50 years.
Well, good morning, everyone, and let me thank all of you for coming out here this morning. My friends, every 4 years, candidates seeking the presidency of the United States rediscover Cuba. They traveled to Florida and pledged to maintain sanctions against the government of Fidel Castro until democracy flowers on the island of Cuba. Today, with the election 14 months away, the Miami pilgrimage has already begun. One of my Democratic opponents has already pledged to maintain the embargo. Another proposes to slightly change the policy. I come here today to say that the 50th anniversary of this policy will be its last. In the Dodd presidency on June 20th, 2009, America's failed Cuban policy will end, and a new era will begin. An era of greater American safety and security, an era of strength, optimism, and confidence, an era without fear. And I thank you all for listening this morning.
In Miami-Dade, where the Cuban-American voter has strong ties to the subject, such words have not been welcomed and the voters have not been shy about it.
Better ambassadors for freedom than Cuban Americans. And the money they send to Cuba
Outside the auditorium, the message was anti-Obama. Dozens of Cuban Americans protesting the senator's position that travel restrictions to Cuba should be relaxed. I disagree with that because you're only helping the regime that's been there for so long. You're not helping the people.
For some political figures in Washington, the argument is simple and one very close to heart. Lifting the embargo is providing aid and assisting a criminal and terrorist regime.
And yet, we're discussing an amendment that would provide billions of dollars to a terrorist, anti-American regime just 90 miles away from the United States?
Recently, we went on the road to interview voters of Miami-Dade County. The Versailles restaurant in Little Havana was our first stop. Here is what voters had to say about their opinion on the Cuban Embargo Act. Hi, can we have your opinion on the Cuban embargo? Do you think it should be lifted or should it continue?
I think it should continue.
What is your position on the Cuban embargo?
100% for it. I will vote for the president who's for the Cuban embargo. As a matter of fact, he who is not for the embargo will never get my vote again. Because when the Cuban embargo gets taken over and gets lifted, the only people who will benefit will be the government. Fidel Castro's will get more money in Switzerland, not the Cuban people. The Cuban people are actually starving to death, not because of the Cuban embargo. Europe doesn't have a Cuban embargo. Latin America doesn't have a Cuban embargo. Canada doesn't have a Cuban embargo. So what embargo are you talking about? Just for the United States? Guess what? They're not getting my dollars. They want my dollars, they can go to someplace else.
From there, we followed Giuliani on his campaign trail in Miami to a local Spanish radio station. While in the studio, we had the opportunity to meet several politicians who are supporting him, including Florida's Attorney General, Bill McCollum, who believes the embargo should be strengthened. We asked the mayors of Hialeah and Hialeah Gardens, as well as some state representatives, for their current opinion on the Cuban embargo and what they think is the most important campaign issue to Miami-Dade voters.
And uphold the embargo as much as possible so that we're able to create the pressure necessary, and hopefully that there will be, from the inside, there will be the change necessary.
For Miami-Dade voters, obviously number one, and we're dealing with it in Florida, is property taxes and insurance. And I think that, you know, it's not just a Florida issue. It should be a national issue. It should be something that should be looked at the national level. And I think that the next president and Congress and the Senate should take a look at it, because it's not just Florida. If you look at other states, they have other catastrophes as well. So the states need to stay strong on the embargo.
We should keep the embargo. No doubt in my mind that we should maintain the embargo until we have a democratic Cuba, or democratic leadership that will liberate the people of Cuba.
And do you think it's one of an important issue for Florida voters?
Not necessarily Florida voters, but maybe for Cuban American voters here in Dade County.
And most people here feel and believe that the embargo is necessary in order to have our Fidel Castro out of power. Not only Fidel Castro, but his brother as well. So I think it's a very important topic for anyone running here in Miami or South Florida to support the embargo. I think a lot of people say it hasn't worked for 50 years, but we don't know where we would be without the embargo. Maybe we would be 20 years away from a free Cuba. We're now.
I think on your daily life type scenario, we may not be thinking about the embargo. We have to deal with education, we have to deal with taxes, health care, in our daily lives. And I don't think the embargo is at the very top of the list. But when the embargo is touched, or when the discussion turns about the embargo, then I think everybody pays close attention.
Among local politicians and voters, there is little doubt the embargo is indeed a topic of consideration. However, other issues like taxes and home insurance did surface during our interviews, making the embargo only one of the many issues facing the candidates during Florida's primary. For C-SPAN StudentCam, reporting, this is Kristen, Cuba, and Alexandria, Segovia.